Before we dive into tonight's tale, make sure to hit that subscribe button if you want more creepy stories that will keep you up at night. So picture this. It's my first night at St. Mercy Hospital. I'm Dr. Maya Patel, a virologist with the CDC, but tonight I'm just the night nurse. Why? Because something about this place didn't add up. I'd been going through their records for weeks, and the disease patterns I found, they were impossible. Like diseases that shouldn't exist anymore, or ones that hadn't even been discovered yet. It didn't make sense, and I had to see it for myself. The hospital was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your footsteps echo too loud. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering just enough to make you second guess if you really saw that shadow move. I was in the lab, prepping some routine bacterial cultures. You know, the usual stuff. Petri dishes, agar, the faint smell of antiseptic that never really goes away. I was zoning out a little, just going through the motions, when I noticed something off. The bacteria weren't growing like they should. Instead of spreading out in random colonies, they were forming patterns. At first, I thought it was a fluke, maybe the agar was uneven or something, but when I flipped on the blacklight, my stomach dropped. The patterns weren't random, they were words, clear, deliberate words. My hands were shaking as I read them, and I swear the air in the room got colder. There were 7 rules written in glowing bacterial trails. I'll never forget how they looked, like something alive was trying to communicate with me. Here's what they said. Rule 1. When a patient's fever exceeds 103 degrees Fahrenheit, place them in isolation immediately, even if they show no other symptoms. Rule 2. Never turn off the UV sanitizing lights in the East Wing, even during power outages. Rule 3. If a patient speaks in any language they didn't know before admission, sedate them before they finish their first sentence. Rule 4. Blood samples must be destroyed by incineration within 1 hour of collection. Rule 5. If you see mold growing in geometric patterns, evacuate the room and initiate decontamination. Rule 6. Patients who share the same symptoms must be kept at least 3 rooms apart. Rule 7. Never let bodily fluids from different patients make contact, even after disposal. I stood there, staring at those words, my mind racing. What the hell was going on in this hospital? And why did these rules feel less like guidelines and more like warnings? I didn't have time to think about it too much, though, because that's when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic beeping from one of the patient monitors down the hall. It was steady, almost hypnotic, but something about it set my nerves on edge. I grabbed my clipboard and headed out of the lab, the rules still burning in my mind. The hallway was dim, the kind of dim where the shadows seemed to stretch just a little too far. As I walked, I could hear the hum of the UV lights in the East Wing, a low, constant buzz that felt almost alive. I didn't know it yet, but those lights were the least of my worries. So, there I was, doing my rounds. It was around 2 a.m., that dead zone of the night where even the hospital feels like it's holding its breath. The halls were quiet except for the occasional beep of a monitor or the distant shuffle of a janitor's mop. I was checking on patient Sarah Chen, a 34-year-old woman admitted earlier that day for what seemed like a mild flu. She'd been stable all evening, no red flags, just a low-grade fever and some fatigue. Routine stuff. I walked into her room, the soft glow of her monitor casting a pale light across the walls. She was asleep, her breathing steady, but something felt off. I can't explain it, just a gut feeling, like the air in the room was heavier than it should have been. I checked her vitals, and that's when I saw it. Her temperature had spiked to 103.1 degrees. My stomach dropped. Rule 1 flashed in my mind. When a patient's fever exceeds 103 degrees Fahrenheit, place them in isolation immediately, even if they show no other symptoms. I didn't hesitate. I hit the call button for assistance, but no one answered. The intercom just crackled with static, like the hospital itself was trying to tell me something. I grabbed the wheelchair by the door and gently shook Sarah awake. Sarah? Hey Sarah, I need you to sit up for me, okay? We're going to move you to another room. She groaned, her eyes fluttering open. They were glassy, unfocused, like she wasn't fully there. What's happening? She mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. It's just a precaution, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Your fever's a little high, so we're going to get you somewhere more comfortable. She didn't argue, just let me help her into the wheelchair. As I pushed her down the hall, the wheels squeaked against the linoleum, the sound echoing way too loud in the empty corridor. The isolation room was in the east wing, and with every step the hum of the UV lights grew louder, that low, persistent buzz that felt like it was vibrating in my bones. That's when it happened. I glanced down at Sarah just to make sure she was okay, and I froze. For a split second, her skin, it wasn't there. I mean, it was, but it was like it had turned transparent, like looking through fogged glass. And underneath, oh God, underneath, I could see her organs. But they weren't where they were supposed to be. Her heart was too far to the left, her liver was upside down, and her intestines were coiled in these intricate, almost artistic patterns. It looked like one of those medieval medical diagrams I'd studied back at the CDC, the kind where they didn't really know how the body worked, so they just guessed. I blinked, and it was gone. Her skin was normal again, her breathing steady, like nothing had happened. But I couldn't unsee it. My hands were trembling on the wheelchair handles, and I had to force myself to keep moving. We reached the isolation room, and I got her settled as quickly as I could. She was barely awake by then, her head lolling to the side as I hooked her up to the monitors. The room was cold, the kind of cold that sinks into your skin and stays there. I double-checked the door locks and the UV lights, making sure everything was secure. As I left the room, I couldn't shake the image of her organs. Those impossible patterns burned into my mind. I kept telling myself it was just fatigue, maybe a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew better. Something was very, very wrong in this hospital. And those rules? They weren't just guidelines. They were the only thing standing between us and whatever the hell was lurking in the shadows. It was around 3 a.m. when the power went out. 1 second, the hospital was humming along, the fluorescent lights buzzing, the monitors beeping, and the next, everything went dark. For a split second, there was complete silence, and then the emergency generators kicked in, flooding the halls with this eerie, dim red light. My heart was already racing when I heard the alarms start blaring from the east wing. Rule 2 flashed in my mind. Never turn off the UV sanitizing lights in the east wing, even during power outages. I took off running, my shoes slapping against the linoleum, the sound echoing way too loud in the empty halls. The red emergency lights made everything look surreal, like I was in some kind of nightmare. I could hear the distant sound of nurses and orderlies shouting, their voices muffled and panicked. But I didn't stop. I had to get to the east wing. When I got there, the UV lights were flickering, struggling to stay on. The hum they usually made was sputtering, like they were gasping for air. I rushed to the emergency power panel, my hands shaking as I flipped the switches to reroute power. The lights stabilized, but the hum was still off, lower and more guttural than before. It felt wrong, like the lights themselves were alive and pissed off. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and that's when I noticed it. 2 rooms, side by side, both with patients showing identical symptoms. Rule 6 screamed in my head. Patients who share the same symptoms must be kept at least 3 rooms apart. What the hell? I muttered under my breath, pulling up the patient charts on the nearest computer. Sure enough, both patients had been admitted with the same high fever, same respiratory issues, same everything. And they were right next to each other. I didn't have time to figure out who screwed up. I grabbed a wheelchair and headed into the first room. The patient, a middle-aged man named Mr. Harris, was asleep, his breathing shallow. I didn't wake him, just started unhooking his IV and monitors as quietly as I could. That's when I saw it, the IV bag. It was pulsing. Not like a heartbeat, but slow and deliberate, like it was breathing. The fluid inside wasn't the usual clear saline. It was shifting colors, from a sickly yellow to a deep, oily black. I froze, staring at it, my mind racing. The yellow reminded me of something I'd read about, ancient Roman plagues, the kind that wiped out entire cities. And the black, that was medieval. The Black Death. I shook my head, trying to focus. Get it together, Maya, I whispered to myself. I finished unhooking Mr. Harris and wheeled him out into the hall. As I passed the second room, I glanced inside. The patient there, a woman named Miss Carter, was also hooked up to an IV, and hers was pulsing too, in perfect sync with Mr. Harris's. The fluids inside were shifting through the same colors, like they were connected somehow. I didn't stick around to figure it out. I wheeled Mr. Harris down the hall, putting as much distance between him and Miss Carter as I could. The whole time, I could feel the IV bag pulsing in the corner of my vision, like it was watching me. When I got Mr. Harris settled in a new room, I double-checked the UV lights and the monitors. Everything seemed stable, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air in the east wing felt heavier, like it was charged with static, and the hum of the UV lights was still too low, too guttural. I headed back to check on Miss Carter, but as I passed the room where Mr. Harris had been, I stopped. The IV bag was still there, hanging from the empty stand. And it was still pulsing, the fluids inside shifting through those impossible colors. I didn't touch it. I didn't even go inside. I just stood there, staring, until the sound of a monitor beeping down the hall snapped me out of it. Whatever was happening in this hospital, it was bigger than I could have imagined. And those rules? They weren't just about keeping patients safe. They were about keeping something else contained. Something ancient. Something dangerous. It was around 4 a.m. when I got the call about patient 23. He'd been admitted earlier that night, delirious and running a high fever. The nurse on duty said he'd been muttering something she couldn't understand, and his vitals were all over the place. I grabbed my kit and headed to his room, the rules already ticking like a countdown in the back of my mind. When I walked in, the room was dim, the only light coming from the monitors casting a faint blue glow. The patient, a man in his late 50s with graying hair and a gaunt face, was thrashing in bed, his eyes wide but unfocused. His skin was slick with sweat, and the smell of sickness hung heavy in the air, a mix of antiseptic and something else, something sour and ancient. Hey, it's okay," I said, trying to keep my voice calm as I approached the bed. "I'm Dr. Patel. I'm just going to take a little blood, all right?" He didn't respond, just kept muttering under his breath. At first, I couldn't make out the words. They were low and guttural, like a chant. But as I tied the tourniquet around his arm and prepped the needle, his voice suddenly cleared. And that's when I realized he wasn't speaking English. It was Latin, not just random words either. He was speaking fluently, his voice rising and falling with the cadence of someone giving a speech. My hands froze mid-motion, the needle hovering above his arm. I'd studied enough medical history to recognize some of the words: pestis, morbus, mors, plague, disease, death. Rule 3 slammed into my thoughts. If a patient speaks in any language they didn't know before admission, sedate them before they finish their first sentence. I dropped the needle and reached for the sedative, my hands trembling. But before I could administer it, he locked eyes with me. His gaze was sharp, piercing, like he could see straight through me. And then he said it, his voice clear and steady. "The walls remember every disease." The second the words left his mouth, something changed. The air in the room felt heavier, charged with a kind of static that made the hair on my arms stand up. The patient's body went rigid, his eyes rolling back, and then he collapsed against the pillows, unconscious. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding, the sedative still in my hand. I'd broken Rule 3. I'd let him finish his sentence. And now I didn't know what was going to happen. I forced myself to focus. I still needed that blood sample. I finished drawing the blood, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the vial. As I sealed it, I noticed something strange. The blood inside wasn't sitting still. It was moving, shifting, like it was alive. I should have destroyed it right then. Rule 4 was clear. Blood samples must be destroyed by incineration within 1 hour of collection. But I couldn't. Not after what I'd just heard. Not after what I'd just seen. I took the vial back to the lab, my mind racing. The hallways felt longer than usual, the red emergency lights casting strange shadows on the walls. When I got to the lab, I slid the vial under the microscope, my hands still trembling. At first, it looked normal, just red blood cells floating in plasma. But then, slowly, the bacteria in the sample began to change. They multiplied at an impossible rate, evolving right before my eyes. I watched as they formed intricate patterns, tiny structures that looked like buildings, ancient hospitals, healing temples, even what looked like a medieval plague house. It was like watching millions of years of medical history unfold in seconds. I couldn't look away. It was horrifying and beautiful at the same time. like staring into the heart of something far older and more powerful than I could comprehend. The bacteria weren't just alive, they were remembering, rebuilding. And then it hit me. What the patient had said, the walls remember every disease. This hospital wasn't just a building, it was a living archive, a repository for every disease that had ever existed. And the rules? They weren't just protocols. They were safeguards, designed to keep that knowledge contained. I didn't destroy the sample. I couldn't. Not when it felt like I was on the verge of understanding something monumental. But as I sat there, staring into the microscope, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd crossed a line, that I'd let something out that wasn't meant to be seen. And I was right. It was just past 5 a.m. when I found the mold. I was doing a final sweep of the east wing, checking for anything out of place before my shift ended. The red emergency lights were still on, casting everything in this eerie, blood-like glow. The air felt heavy, like it was holding its breath, and the hum of the UV lights was still off, too low, too guttural. I was about to head back to the lab when I noticed the door to the storage room was slightly ajar. I don't know why, but something about it made me stop. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to stretch out from the crack, or the faint smell of dampness that wafted out, sharp and earthy. I pushed the door open, and that's when I saw it. The mold. It wasn't just growing, it was forming patterns. Geometric shapes, perfectly symmetrical, spiraling across the walls and floor like some kind of organic circuit board. The colors were wrong too. Shades of green and black that seemed to shift when you looked at them too long, like they were alive. Rule 5 flashed in my mind. If you see mold growing in geometric patterns, evacuate the room and initiate decontamination. I didn't waste any time. I backed out of the room, my heart pounding, and hit the emergency decontamination button on the wall. The alarms blared, and the sprinklers kicked on, flooding the room with a fine mist of disinfectant. I could hear the hiss of the chemicals as they hit the mold, the smell sharp and acrid, burning my nose. But the mold didn't dissolve. It just shifted. The patterns rearranged themselves like they were reacting to the chemicals. I stood there, frozen, watching as the shapes morphed into something even more intricate, almost like a language. That's when I realized I'd made a mistake. In my rush to start the decontamination, I'd left the drain in the room open. And now, the runoff, fluids from different patients mixed together, was pooling near the drain. Rule 7 screamed in my head. Never let bodily fluids from different patients make contact, even after disposal. I moved to close the drain, but it was too late. The fluids had already mixed, and they were changing. The colors swirled together, forming new shades that didn't exist in nature. Deep purples, iridescent greens, colors that hurt to look at. And then, slowly, the fluids began to rise, pulling themselves up from the floor like they had a mind of their own. I backed away, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. The fluids twisted and coiled, forming shapes that looked like tools. Medical tools, but not like any I'd ever seen. Some were ancient, crude scalpels, bone saws, things that belonged in a medieval surgeon's kit. Others were futuristic, sleek and metallic, with designs that looked like they'd been pulled straight out of a sci-fi movie. And then, worst of all, they started moving. The tools floated in the air, rotating slowly, like they were being examined by invisible hands. I could hear a faint hum, low and resonant, like the sound of machinery powering up. The air in the room felt charged, electric, and I could taste metal on my tongue, sharp and bitter. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. The alarms were still blaring, the sound echoing in my skull, and I could feel the vibrations of whatever was happening in that room through the floor. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing. The rules weren't just guidelines, they were warnings, and every time I broke one, something worse happened. The hospital wasn't just a building, it was alive, and it was trying to tell me something, but I wasn't sure I wanted to know what. By the time my shift ended, I was running on pure adrenaline. The storage room was sealed, the decontamination process still humming away behind the locked door, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The hospital felt different, like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to figure something out. I sat in the lab, staring at the blood sample I'd taken from the Latin-speaking patient. It was still under the microscope, the bacteria inside frozen in their impossible formations, tiny hospitals, temples, and structures I couldn't even name. My mind kept circling back to what he'd said. The walls remember every disease. At first I thought it was just delirium, the ramblings of a feverish mind. But now I wasn't so sure. Every rule I'd broken, every incident I'd witnessed, it all felt connected, like pieces of a puzzle I was only just starting to see. I thought about the patient with the transparent skin, her organs arranged like a medieval diagram. I thought about the IV bags pulsing in sync, their fluids shifting through colors that matched ancient plagues. I thought about the mold, the geometric patterns that seemed to rearrange themselves, and the tools that had formed from the mixed fluids, tools that looked like they belonged to different eras, different worlds. And then it hit me. This hospital wasn't just treating diseases. It wasn't even just containing them. It was a crossroads, a place where diseases from every point in time, past, present, and future, converged. The rules weren't safety protocols. They were containment procedures, designed to keep these diseases from spilling out into the world, from rewriting history itself. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. The delayed sedation, it had allowed me to hear that crucial phrase, the walls remember every disease. The preserved blood sample, it had shown me millions of years of bacterial evolution, the history of medicine written in microscopic structures. The mixed fluids, they demonstrated the hospital's ability to reconstruct knowledge from across time, to pull fragments of the past and future into the present. It all made sense. Horrifying, impossible sense. I stood up, pacing the lab, my thoughts spiraling. The UV lights in the east wing, they weren't just sanitizing. They were stabilizing, keeping the temporal boundaries intact. The isolation rooms, they weren't just for contagious patients. They were for patients who carried diseases that didn't belong in this time. The rules, they weren't just guidelines. They were the only thing keeping the hospital, and maybe the world, from collapsing under the weight of all that knowledge. I stopped pacing, my eyes landing on the blood sample again. The bacteria were still there, frozen in their impossible formations. I thought about the patient who'd spoken Latin, about the tools that had formed from the mixed fluids, about the mold that had shifted and rearranged itself. And I realized something else. The hospital wasn't just a passive repository. It was alive. It was learning, adapting, trying to communicate, and it had chosen me to see it, to understand it. But why? I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't unsee what I'd seen. I couldn't unknow what I now knew. The hospital was more than a building. It was a living, breathing entity, a guardian of knowledge that humanity wasn't ready for. And I was part of it now, whether I wanted to be or not. I sat back down, my hands trembling as I reached for the microscope. There was still so much I didn't understand, so many questions I couldn't answer. But one thing was clear. The rules weren't just there to protect the patients. They were there to protect the world, and I had to follow them. No matter what. It started with a cough. Just one, at first. A dry, hacking sound from down the hall, then another and another. Within minutes, the entire east wing was echoing with the sound of patients coughing, their voices overlapping in a chorus of sickness. I was in the lab when it happened, reviewing the blood sample from the Latin-speaking patient, when the alarm started blaring. Code red, mass infection event. I grabbed my kit and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallways were chaos, nurses rushing from room to room, patients crying out, monitors beeping frantically. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and antiseptic, and the red emergency lights made everything look surreal, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I reached the first patient, a young woman gasping for breath, her skin pale and clammy. Her fever was spiking, 103.5 degrees Fahrenheit and climbing. I moved her to isolation, following Rule 1, but as I hooked her up to the monitors, I realized something was different this time. Her blood, it was darker, almost black, and it moved sluggishly like it was fighting against her veins. I drew a sample, my hands shaking, and that's when I saw it. The bacteria in her blood were forming patterns again, but this time they weren't just shapes, they were words. Tiny, glowing words in a language I didn't recognize, but somehow I understood. Warning, convergence, pandemic. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just an infection, it was a warning, a message, and I needed to understand it. But Rule 4 was clear. Blood samples must be destroyed by incineration within 1 hour of collection. I stood there, staring at the vial, my mind racing. If I destroyed the sample, I might never know what the bacteria were trying to say. But if I kept it, if I broke the rules, what would happen? What was worse, the risk of breaking containment, or the risk of ignoring a warning that could save countless lives? I made my choice. I took the sample back to the lab, my heart pounding with every step. The alarms were still blaring, the sound echoing in my skull, but I forced myself to focus. I slid the vial under the microscope, my hands trembling as I adjusted the lens. At first, it looked normal, just red blood cells floating in plasma. But then, slowly, the bacteria began to change. They multiplied at an impossible rate, forming patterns that shifted and rearranged themselves like a living puzzle. And then finally, they formed words. Future. Connection. All diseases. I stared at the words, my mind racing. The bacteria weren't just warning me about a future pandemic. They were telling me that it was connected to every disease that had ever existed. The Black Death, the Spanish flu, COVID-19, they weren't separate events. They were all part of the same pattern, the same cycle. And the hospital, it wasn't just containing diseases, it was trying to stop the cycle. I leaned back in my chair, my hands shaking, my mind reeling. The rules weren't just there to protect the present, they were there to protect the future. And I'd just broken one of them. But I didn't have time to regret it. The alarms were still blaring, the sound growing louder, more urgent. I could hear the sound of footsteps running down the hall, voices shouting, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the microscope. The bacteria were still shifting, still forming new words, new patterns. And then, finally, they formed one last message. Choose. Save them, or save the world. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if there was even a right choice. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't ignore this. I couldn't pretend I hadn't seen it. I grabbed the vial and ran, my mind racing, my heart pounding. The hospital was alive, and it was trying to tell me something, and I had to listen, no matter what it cost. The alarms were still blaring, the sound like a hammer against my skull. I could hear the chaos in the halls, patients coughing, nurses shouting, monitors screaming, but it all felt distant, like I was standing at the edge of a storm. The hospital was alive, and it was asking me to make a choice I wasn't sure I was ready to make. But I didn't have time to hesitate. The infection was spreading too fast. Patients were deteriorating by the minute, their fevers spiking, their blood turning black and sluggish. And the bacteria, they were trying to tell me something that could save us all. I looked down at the vial, the blood inside swirling with patterns that shifted and danced like living ink. I thought about the rules, about the patients, about the hospital and its impossible, ancient purpose. And then I thought about the future, about the pandemic the bacteria had warned me about the millions of lives that could be lost if I didn't act. I made my choice. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling as I prepared the syringe. The blood sample was thick, almost viscous, and it glowed faintly under the lab lights like it was alive. I didn't know what would happen when I injected it into myself. I didn't know if it would kill me, or change me, or something worse, but I knew I had to do it. I slid the needle into my arm, the sting sharp and immediate. The blood flowed into my veins, cold at first, then burning like liquid fire spreading through my body. I gasped, my vision blurring, my knees buckling as I collapsed to the floor. The pain was indescribable. It felt like my body was being torn apart and put back together, like every cell was being rewritten. I could feel the bacteria inside me, multiplying, evolving, merging with my own DNA. And then slowly the pain began to fade, replaced by something else, a strange humming awareness, like I could feel the hospital breathing around me. I stood up, my legs shaky but steady. My skin felt different, cooler, smoother, almost translucent in the dim light. I looked at my hands and that's when I saw it. Shadows moving under my skin, swirling patterns of bacteria and blood, shifting and rearranging themselves like living ink. I was part of the hospital now, part of its system, part of its purpose. I didn't know if I'd made the right choice, but I knew one thing for sure. I'd done what I had to do. I still work the night shift at St. Mercy Hospital. The rules are still in place and I still follow them, most of the time. But now I understand their true purpose. They're not just containment procedures. They're safeguards, designed to maintain the delicate balance of diseases across time, and I'm part of that balance now. My blood writes new rules in bacterial cultures, preparing for future threats. The bacteria inside me are alive, constantly evolving, constantly communicating. They show me things, patterns, warnings, glimpses of diseases that haven't happened yet, and I use that knowledge to keep the hospital and the world safe. The transformation is permanent. My body is a living repository, a human archive of every disease that ever existed or will exist. The shadows under my skin never stop moving, and my eyes, well, let's just say they're not exactly human anymore. They swirl with patterns of bacteria, shifting and changing like living kaleidoscopes. Patients and staff notice, of course. They ask questions, their voices tinged with fear and curiosity. "Dr. Patel, what's wrong with your eyes? Why do your hands look like that?" I don't answer. Not really. I just check their temperature, make sure they're following the rules, and move on. Because every fever, every cough, every symptom, it could be the start of something bigger, something worse. The hospital is alive, and it's always watching, always waiting. And now, so am I. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if I'll ever be able to leave this place, or if I'll spend the rest of my life, however long that is, walking these halls, listening to the hum of the UV lights, watching the shadows move under my skin. But I do know one thing. The rules are there for a reason, and as long as I'm here, I'll make sure they're followed. Because every fever could be the start of history rewriting itself, and I can't let that happen. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more creepy stories. Stay safe, and see you in the next nightmare.